Hello, I'm Kip Sigmund, a Typesafe consultant and trainer, and I'm going to walk you through an introduction to SBT. SBT is a powerful and flexible build tool used for Scala projects. I'll start by showing you where to get and install SBT, how to create a basic project, how to use some of the common commands and run some of the common tasks, how to add a managed library dependency, how to install an SBT plugin, and then I'll wrap up with a few other tricks that you'll find useful. To start, go to scala-sbt.org and click on this download link. There you'll be able to find a distribution and installation instructions for whatever your particular platform is. I'm running on a Mac, so I used Homebrew to install SBT, which is pretty simple. I'll switch to a shell now, and I'll start by creating a new project directory, and I'll call the project Hello. Every SBT project has a basic SBT configuration file in the root directory called Build.sbt. So the first thing I'll do is create that Build.sbt file. This file will contain a list of key value pairs representing either settings or tasks for your SBT project. And I'll add 3 common settings you'll see in most Build.sbt files. The first is I'll define a name for the project. And the second is I'll define a version for the project. I'm going to use semantic versioning conventions here. Call this 001 snapshot. And the third setting I'll define is the Scala version I'd like to compile my project with. And at the time of this video, the latest Scala release is 2.11.1. You'll notice that I separated each of these settings by a blank line. This is important as SBT delimits the different settings by a blank line. So let me save this file. And now I want to create my source directories. SBT borrows from a build tool called Maven and uses something called the Maven standard directory layout. So by default, it'll look for your main application sources in a directory called src/main/scala, and it'll look for your test sources in a directory called src/test/scala. So I'm going to go ahead and create those directories. And I want to create at least one Scala source file so we have something to compile. So I'll put that in src/main/scala. I'll just call it hello.scala. And I'll create an application object so we can also run it. Let's put some very basic functionality in here. Okay, now we can launch SBT in what's called interactive mode by just typing SBT. This assumes SBT is in your path, which it should be after your installation. So this will take a second, and as soon as you see a greater than sign, that's your SBT prompt. And there it is. So the first command you'll want to learn is help. Help will basically show you a list of other commands that are available. And 2 that I might be interested in are this tasks command and this settings command. Now, SBT has a set of settings and most of them have default values. We specified 3 of our own custom values, but if I type settings, you can see a list of all the settings for the project and a basic description of each one. And you'll see the ones we defined: name, version, Scala version. Another command is tasks. And if you worked with other build tools in the past, Maven or Ant or other tools, you'll probably recognize or understand what some of these tasks do. Maven calls these goals, but these are pretty similar naming. So, for example, clean will basically wipe out a previous build. Compile compiles your main sources. Test will compile your test sources and run your tests, and it'll also compile your main sources if necessary. Run runs a main class, etc. So you can run these tasks by typing them into the SBT prompt just like you did with the commands. So let's try a couple of these. Let's first try compile. And you'll see that this compiles the one source file that I created. And because that was an application object, I can also type run. And you'll see that it runs my hello object and prints hello to the standard out here. Now, I would like to run some tests, but first I haven't defined any tests, and I also haven't included a test framework in my build. So I'm going to do that next. I'm going to open up a different tab, different shell in the same directory so that I can edit my build.sbt file. And what I'm going to do is add a managed library dependency in here, but first I need to go find that. I'm going to use a testing library called Scala Test. So I happen to know that on the first page of the scalatest.org user guide are instructions on how to add Scala Test to an SBT project. All I have to do is copy this line and paste it into my build.sbt file. So I'll switch back here and do that. And note that I made sure that I had another space between the last setting and this setting. Now, a couple things to note. First of all is you'll see all my other settings I defined with a key and a colon equals and a value on the right hand side. And that's because these were direct assignments. This library dependencies is actually a collection, and this plus equals will append this library to that collection. So you could have a whole list of library dependencies plus equal and for each different library you add. Also, on the right hand side of this, under the hood, SBT is using something called Apache Ivy for dependency management. And this is basically constructing a Apache Ivy module. This first part is what's known as a group ID. The second part is an artifact ID. The third part is the version. And this last part is a configuration parameter for SBT. In this particular case, it's specifying that this library dependency is only needed for tasks in the test configuration. Now, you'll notice that the artifact ID has a number at the end of it. This is the Scala version it was compiled with, and this is common with third-party Scala libraries, that they all have the Scala version they were compiled with in their artifact ID. And you'll see this a lot in build.sbt files. You'll see a double % here, and no Scala version in the artifact ID. And what's happening here, this double % will use the Scala version you defined above and append it, at least the major and minor part, not the revision, to this artifact ID when it goes out and searches repositories for this library. So that's a pretty good idea to do that, because then you can change your Scala version and immediately change all your third-party libraries in one snap. Okay, I'll now save this file, and I also want to create a test. So I also happen to know that the next page in this Scala Test user guide has some example tests, so I'm just going to copy the first one. All I'm looking to do is demonstrate that SBT can run the test. I don't really care about the content of the test at this point. So this test is called set suite. So in my source test Scala directory, I'll create a new source file called setsuite.scala. And I'll just paste this in there. Now, I'll go back to my SBT interactive, and I want to run these tests, but now that I've modified the build files, I need to reload the build. So I can do that by typing reload. This will reread the configuration files and reset up the build. And now, if I run test, it should execute the test task. And you'll see it does. It compiles the test source I added and runs a couple other things here. Now, at this point, I'd like to get my project into an IDE and stop using VI Editor. So if I go back to the SBT site and I click on Documentation and search the page for Community Plugins, there we go. You'll see that this page will list a bunch of different plugins for SBT, and here's some plugins for IDEs. And I kind of scan down here. Okay, there's a plugin for Eclipse. This will create my Eclipse project files. So I'll click on that, and if I go to this site, they give me instructions just like Scala tested about how to add this plugin to my project. And it looks like I need to add this line to a file called plugins.sbt, which exists in a subdirectory called project. So I'll go back to my regular shell here, and you'll see that when I ran SBT, it created this project directory on its own. So all I have to do is create a new file in there called plugins.sbt and paste this line adding the SBT Eclipse plugin. And remember, now that I've edited my build files, I'll need to type reload again with correct spelling. And you can see that reloaded my build. And I can go back to the site and it tells me how to use the Eclipse plugin. It says basically adding this plugin gave me a new command called Eclipse, which will create Eclipse project files. So I'll do that. Type Eclipse. It's now created my Eclipse project files. And now I should be able to import this project into Eclipse as an existing project. And there it is. Recognizes it as a project. And you'll see it's got everything set up correctly. Here's my source directories are marked correctly, and the reference libraries, and it's using the Scala version I specified, etc. And I'd like to show you a couple more things. I'm going to create one more source file in here. I'm just going to create a very simple, I'm going to create another Scala class. I'll just call it user. And I'll give it one immutable field called name of type string. I don't really need these comments. Okay. Now, the reason why I did this is because I wanted to demonstrate that from your interactive SBT, you can launch into the Scala REPL by typing console. And if you've used the Scala REPL before, this is really neat to use it through SBT because I now have all my managed dependency libraries and all my project sources in my class path. So I can use those directly without having to import them or specifying them when I start up the REPL. So I should just be able to type something like this. And you'll see it creates a user object. If I type kip.name, shows that the name is there. And you can exit back out of the REPL like this by just typing :Q. Now, one other thing that you might find interesting is instead of typing some of these tasks like compile, which will run at once, you can type a tilde before it. And we'll do it in what's called continuous mode. And now anytime I change a source file, it'll automatically compile. So I can go back in here, maybe add another field to this class, and if we jump back here, you'll see that it compiled on its own. The last thing I'd like to show you is I'm going to exit completely out of the SBT interactive mode, and you can also run SBT in what's called batch mode, which means you can type SBT and then give it a list of commands that you want to run, and it'll run all those. In this case, it's 2 tasks, clean and test. It'll run these tasks and then exit right out of SBT. So sometimes this is useful if you're making a lot of changes and you don't want to keep typing reload, or if you're using one shell for a lot of different work. And that about covers an introduction to SBT. I'd like to point you to a couple different things to learn more and for your next steps. If you go back to the SBT site and you click on documentation, you'll see there's a getting started guide here, and pretty much everything I demonstrate was taken out of portions of this getting started guide, and this is very helpful, and I would suggest spending some time to read through this, and you can learn a lot more about project settings and different commands and so forth. And by the end of this getting started guide, which should only take you a couple hours, you'll be a pretty powerful user already. The other thing I would recommend is downloading and installing Typesafe Activator. And Activator will give you access to a ton of different templates and starter projects, all of which use SBT to build, and you can use that to see examples of SBT files in real projects, and you can get ideas and get a good sense of what a real SBT configuration file looks like with a lot of project dependencies and so forth. And if you have questions, you can always find me on Twitter at KipSigman. Thank you.